But the aim is that I give an overview of 1 Corinthians, focus on 1 Corinthians 13, and give some pointers for guys who are likely to want to get some help because they've been given the opportunity, the responsibility of preaching from this passage. And so we're going to think about all those kind of issues this evening. So 1 Corinthians is a great book, and it's not one I have preached from it from time to time, but
How many weddings have you read this on? How many weddings would you say?
Quite a lot actually. Yeah. And that's one of the first things that I want to say is that this chapter has got nothing to do with weddings.
No.
The context is church unity, where spiritual gifts have become an issue, and all sorts of other issues have become issues. And it's not to say that it isn't applicable to weddings and marriage. Love is patient, love is kind. I am patient, I am kind. My wife is patient and she is kind. So yeah, we will. That sounds good, doesn't it? Those are good qualities, and I've preached at weddings loads of times and used this as text, and I'll do it again. But that's not the original context, and I'm going to have a talk about text in context tonight and how we interpret the Bible, how it's how it works. So 1 Corinthians 13, incidentally, for those early birds who come here, doesn't mention God, doesn't mention Jesus, doesn't use the word Christ, and doesn't mention the cross. Nowhere in the chapter. Absolutely nowhere. That's amazing, isn't it? I'm sure you all knew that anyway. Paul can't stop talking about Jesus in some places, and here he's talking about love, but he doesn't use the name of God, Christ, cross, all the things that we kind of associate with love. And I want to talk about love in particular because we are going to focus on that subject in the preaching. But let's start with Corinthians. Let's start with Corinth, and I hope that there will be people from CJC here, because Beulah, Forestdale and CJC are all embarking on this series. And Corinth, as you can see ringed in the map, is on the southern tip, or towards the southern end of Greece. If you go across that bit of blue to the right, that's the Aegean Sea. And here we are, there's Ephesus, there's Corinth. And Paul comes to Corinth and spends about 18 months there, establishes the church, goes off on a bit of a journey, and then he ends up in Ephesus, and he hears that there's trouble in Corinth. He goes back, he doesn't get it sorted, he comes back, and then they write him a letter. He writes a letter, not 1 Corinthians, we don't have that letter. I'll go over this again in a minute. And then Paul writes 1 Corinthians as a response to the fact he's had some people who are reporting. So there's a lot of kind of communication of troubles over the Aegean Sea, and so that's the kind of simple background. Here we are. There's Corinth, near Athens. Paul had been into Athens. You could read about this in Acts 18. And then he didn't have a very successful time in Athens, so he came down to Corinth. And Corinth was situated, there's a little thing here somewhere called the Isthmus, which is a kind of very narrow canal, which saves sailors the trouble of going all the way around the bottom of Greece and all around the other side. They could just cut through. But of course the Corinthians knew how to make money by just charging a little bit of tax and duty and so on. So Corinth became a seafaring city, it became a wealthy city, and we're talking pre-Roman, and then it was destroyed and it lay in ruins for about 100 years. And then, I forget the exact date, Julius Caesar came and re-established Corinth as a Roman city. And so it had a long classical history. There we are, it was 44 BC, Julius Caesar came in. And it had a renowned reputation. To be Corinthian was to be licentious, immoral. It was known for kind of decadence, and that was the ancient city. But the city at the time of Paul had also it got a kind of pattern of life that corresponded to that. So they hadn't thrown off the old and reformed. That's how they were. And when Paul came there, he would have discovered a multicultural city. It was Greek, it was Roman, there were Jewish people, there were Phoenicians, and there were all kind of tradespeople. There were locals, there were travellers. So it was a very cosmopolitan kind of place. And therefore, although it was a Roman city, it was an international city and a multicultural place. So when Paul arrived somewhere around the year 49 AD, he encounters people, he preaches the gospel, he has some trouble, he's in the synagogue at first, he gets thrown out of the synagogue leader gets saved, goes with Paul, there's another guy there, there's irritations between the church and the synagogue. The church is kind of going forward, but some of its history, some of its moral, spiritual ancestry is still very present in the way that the church experiences. And as I already said, there's been these updates, these issues that were sent to Paul. Then Paul wrote the letter, which he mentions in 2 Corinthians somewhere, about this is his third letter, and obviously we haven't got this one, so it's called the lost letter. And then there's a report and a letter that was sent from Corinth to Paul, and then Paul is replying around about 54 AD. So there's loads of really exciting things I could say about this, but it's one of the earliest letters. It's nobody ever, all the scholars agree this is authentic, it's Paul that wrote it, so there's none of the sort of silly academic disputes to go on about this. And after Paul wrote this letter, he visits again. That still didn't resolve everything. And so 2 Corinthians was written, which is a very, very emotional, turbulent letter. Some of it's more positive than others. Some of it's... Anyway, there we are. Now, here's the thing that's particularly relevant for those of us who are from Thornton Heath, connected with Forestdale, and with a vision to plant churches across Croydon, with a view to relating with CJC, Selsdon, and working together, becoming one church. That's what we've been exploring and what we're pursuing. And multi-site is exactly what you've got in this place. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, I think, he says, I've heard a report from Chloe's people. Now, we don't know exactly who Chloe's people are, but in a city the size of Corinth, it's likely that there were different households, oikoses, little groups of Christians that met together, and we would call them cells or home groups or whatever, but they were actually house churches, and they had their own leader, and they had their own flavour. And some of them would have probably been more Greek, some of them would have been more Jewish, some of them may have been old, young, whatever. But Chloe's people sent a message to Paul to say, there's trouble at Mill, lad. And there was trouble at Mill. There was a lot of trouble. There were lots of issues that Paul addresses in this letter. And there's moral issues, there's theological issues, there's relationship issues. This is some of the things that they were facing. They were facing divisions, issues about sex, issues about food, issues about worship, and issues about doctrine. And so you can't read this letter through without realizing there is a huge amount of feeling, problems, and challenges. Who wants to be the church pastor of Corinth? Well, as we often say when we read these ancient books, it's amazing how many parallels there are with the modern world and the modern church. Because we do find that we have a very divided church. There are over 250 churches in Croydon, and a lot of them wouldn't exist if unity had been achieved. But they've gone off and done their own thing. Issues of sex. Oh yes, we've had our issues with sex. What about food? Well, we do have issues with food. It may not be quite the same as it was in Corinth, but for some people in the church of Jesus Christ in Croydon, certain foods they don't eat. Others don't drink alcohol. Others are happy with alcohol. So food is still an issue. As for worship, there's charismatic, non-charismatic, pro-charismatic, anti-charismatic. There's liturgical, high church, low church, middle church, all sorts of churches that exist within Croydon. And we exist within that kind of wider expression of the body of Christ. Well, I don't know that we've got so many people in the modern church in Croydon who question the resurrection, but they did in Corinth, so just for good measure. So here's a few things to say about the church in Corinth. They're not a model, but an example. You can't say this is, we all want to be a Corinthian church. You know, people might talk about the church in the Philippian church, because they seem to have had just about the most perfect relationship with Paul. But nobody says, our model is the Corinthian church. Let's aspire to be Corinthian. And to be honest, I think that a lot of times people look at the Bible as an ideal and they expect it to sort of to exemplify things. But what it actually shows us is that the church is made up of ordinary people who make a right pig's ear, if that's not too non-kosher a statement. You have the tension between the ideal that is taught in the doctrine and the actual that is worked out in life. And every church on this planet has to work with that tension. We've got a vision of what we should be, and then you've got the reality. What is it? To live above with saints we love, oh, wouldn't that be glory? To live below with saints we know, well, that's another story. And that's the truth. The church militant and the church triumphant. The church on earth is a challenge to us all. Okay, you've got those three enemies, the world, the flesh and the devil, and then throw in the church for a fourth for some. Okay, and yet Paul writes this letter, and he starts in 1 verse 3 with even 1 verse 2, to the church of God in Corinth, to those sanctified. Sanctified? My goodness me, Paul, what's the matter with you? Are you blind? No. He knows exactly what God is doing, despite the fact that the people aren't perfect. And that will help him later when he's talking about love is patient, because he's exemplifying patience. Okay, he says in verse 3, grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. That's how we get into the kingdom, and that's how we stay in the kingdom. Grace. Grace is what the New Testament is all about. That's the foundation of this church. And then verse 4 is, I think, one of the most miraculous verses in the Bible. If you want to get into the gift of miracles, here's an expression of it. I thank God for you all because of the grace given you. Really, Paul? You know, have you forgotten your kind of list of things that you're about to address? But Paul is nevertheless thankful for these people, and he wants them to know it and to feel it. For you, in him, you have been enriched in every way, in all your speaking and all your knowledge. Well, that's amazing, because it was their speaking and their knowledge that was causing a lot of these problems. And yet Paul doesn't speak against that. He commends them and praises God, even though the things that they have, they're using in a way that is wrong. So the ideal is not set to criticize the actual, but to encourage the church to move forward towards it. And I know sometimes people do become quite critical of the church, quite disillusioned, because the grace that is needed to be patient and loving and kind and all the rest of it with an imperfect group of people is it's a discipline. It's not just an experience of grace, it's a discipline to maintain a gracious attitude. Okay, so what is the answer, Paul, to these problems? We say the church is the answer. Well, the church was the problem. Apostolic leadership is the answer. Well, Paul was writing to them, he'd visited them, people had been coming and going, delegates, and that had not made this church perfect. We say the gospel is the answer. Yes, the gospel is the answer, but the gospel will not produce a perfect people this side of heaven. We say love is the answer, And for all the negative things that I want to say about the Corinthian church, they were people who were working out what it meant to love one another. And after Easter, that's what Beulah and the other two churches are going to be focusing on, and we're going to be looking at 1 Corinthians 13. So where does Paul get his information from? In chapter 1 verse 11 he says, "My brothers, some of Chloe's household have informed me there are quarrels." In chapter 5 verse 1 he says, "It's actually reported that there's sexual immorality among you." And in chapter 11 verse 18 he says, "In the first place, I hear that when you come together as a church, there are divisions amongst you." So he's got reports, he's had letters, he's had delegation from Chloe's people. He's been given information about what's going on there. And also in chapter 5 verse 1, the church has written to him and asked him to give some directions. That doesn't look like the right reference, but yeah, I'll check that out later. So in chapter 4 verse 17 he mentions that he's sent Timothy. He's going to send Timothy. "For this reason I'm sending to you Timothy, my son whom I love, who is faithful in the Lord." And in Acts 19:22 there's also a reference. I should have written these texts out, but Acts 19:22 says, it speaks about Timothy Erastus, who have and stayed in the province of Asia a little longer. So people were travelling between the church in Corinth. And then Paul mentions a number of people who were leaders who'd gone in. There was Paul, then there was Apollos, then there was Peter, who's named Cephas in this letter, and then there was also Aquila and Priscilla. So the church had some really quality people who were putting into it. But unfortunately, part of the problem was that some people were aligning themselves with Paul, others with Apollos, others with Peter, and others who were the really elite were aligning themselves with Jesus, because that trumped everybody else. But it seems that there were these groups and there were factions. I don't want to go there yet. Now, some of you might already be thinking, goodness me, John, you know, it's all very nice, but this sounds like a history lesson. And I want to tell you that the church in Corinth was addressed in chapter 10. Paul says, "I don't want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea and were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and they all ate the same spiritual food and all drank the same spiritual drink. They drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness." Now listen to verse 6 of chapter 10. "Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did." And I just want to particularly thinking of the preachers, to show you that Paul was addressing this multicultural, multi-site, and he was giving them lessons from another generation, another time, the Israelites in the wilderness. How many years before? Maybe 2,000 something years before. Have I got that right? No, 1,500 years before. So he was saying God was doing things, and this took place as an example for us. And we, by looking at the Corinthian letter, are looking at something that happened in another time, in another culture, in another place, where God was speaking. And we could say of this letter of 1 Corinthians, these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. So just like the Corinthians learned from the Old Testament stories, we also learn from their story and the Old Testament stories. And therefore, let's make sure that we root our understanding of the principles of love in a biblical context. Now here's a verse from later in 1 Corinthians 10. It says, "All things are lawful, not all things are helpful." This is talking about food. "All things, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbour. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising question on the grounds of conscience, for the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Now, I don't think most of us have a problem going into our supermarkets and buying food in case it's been offered up to idols and questions of conscience and should we eat it or shouldn't we eat it. And we'll probably look over that and say, well, that's really irrelevant to us. But that is the context in which Paul says, let no one, verse 24, let no one seek his own good. And if we look, hopefully if we look to let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbour. And this is exactly the same word that's used in 1 Corinthians 13 about love does not insist on its own way. It's not insistent. Let no one seek his own good. Verse 24, let no one seek his own good but that of his neighbour. I've put the same verse twice. There's two verses there. Oh yeah. When we look at love is not, it is not envious. It says, while there is jealousy and strife amongst you, this is back in chapter 3, are you not of the flesh and behaving only in a human way? And the word jealousy is exactly the same word as the envy there. In fact, the words that Paul uses and the challenges that Paul puts in 1 Corinthians 13 are vitally connected to the experience that the Corinthian church is going on. And therefore it's very important that you don't just say, well, for example, let's do the one about jealousy. Or let's take the previous one about it doesn't insist on its own way. Well, I don't know about you. You can imagine a preacher saying, where does insisting on its own way occur most? It's probably in my marriage or in the family life or in my work life. And you begin to connect straight away with your own experience in life, and you could talk about not love not insisting its own way with very little reference to 1 Corinthians. You could use it as just a tag and then off you go. Whereas I think the challenge is to understand, why does Paul include this in this letter? What was important to Paul so that he talks about not insisting its own way, insisting on its own way? For example, when it comes to spiritual gifts, it seems in the church in Corinth that there were some people who were very highly gifted in the area of prophecy, and they just couldn't resist contributing at length. And Paul tells them in one place that if someone gets a revelation while you're speaking, you should sit down and let the other person speak. But I've got a word from God, don't you understand? Love is patient, love is kind. Bear with one another. That's not Corinthians, but bearing with one another. So these situations, or this list of stuff in 1 Corinthians 13 links into the actual life that was going on in Corinth, and it's the oil that is there to ease the wheels from grinding and becoming really difficult. Now, I drew up a little spreadsheet which I might email round to the preachers if they want it, but I was just thinking about, these are the headings of the sermons. An introduction to 1 Corinthians 13, I haven't got much on that, this is the general background, I guess. Love and spiritual gifts, love and faith, love and self-sacrifice, love, patient and kind, envy and boasting, and so on. And I was thinking about how I would approach an interpretation of this. I look at the context of each word in 1 Corinthians. Not just 1 Corinthians 13, but 1 Corinthians. Some of these words are only used once in the whole of the Bible. You don't find much about irritability, for example. It's a word I think is only used twice in the whole of the Bible. Or was it 3 times? I think once in the Old Testament. They're rare words, but they're not rare experience. So the context, you might think about Paul, some of the contention that he had with the woman who was following him in Philippi. She had a demon and she just irritated him. In fact, he got so vexed in the end, he turned around, cast the demon out, and then got into grief with her owners. And anyway. But you could look at this issue of love and irritability. You could think about the way that Paul himself experienced this? Then you think about the biblical context. How does irritability and resentment feature in the wider passages of Scripture? And think of it in terms of the gospel. What has this got to do with the gospel? Earlier on in 1 Corinthians, Paul has talked about the wisdom of God and that he was sent to preach the gospel. And that if we don't preach the gospel, we are failing. So our preaching is not just to give a nice idea about love or a soppy idea, but a Christian idea that's rooted in the gospel, in the Bible, in the letter of Paul, and specifically worked out in the context of 1 Corinthians 13. And then your personal life, and there is another column that talks about the church's life. And so when you come to preach, when you come to look at 1 Corinthians, whether you're just a private Christian reading, you should be thinking about these things, because the Bible has got these kind of principles of interpretation that help us to understand what this text actually means, how it applied in the original setting, the historical context. These things were given to us as examples, so we need to look at them in their context and think through the way that it applies personally, church-wise, and that's the way that we kind of apply this kind of passage to our lives.